Well, many big cities across the world face similar sustainability issues as they make advances in financial, political and cultural development. And the cities deal with their problems in many different ways in accordance with the characteristics of their own urban areas. For example, Hong Kong is dense and filled with skyscrapers, while Los Angeles is essentially horizontal, sprawling out for miles. But LA-based scholar Professor Robert Gottlieb, who's visiting Hong Kong to promote a new book, says despite the differences, cities can learn from each other in areas like fighting air pollution, improving water quality and restructuring the food system. Well, Professor Gottlieb is founder and former director of the Urban and Environmental Policy Institute at Occidental College, and he joins us on the line now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And thank you for joining us on the programme today.
My pleasure.
Now, quite often when we're talking about building a sustainable environment in the cities that we live in, we very often point at the government saying, well, what's the government going to do about this? Or perhaps what business is going to do about this? But you're suggesting that people should take matters a bit more into their own hands. Perhaps you could explain that a bit more.
One of the important lessons from Los Angeles, for example, is around air quality. There were citizen movements that developed as far back as the 1950s that felt the situation was really becoming intolerable, that there needed to be the kind of research that would identify the causes of the problems and then to take action. It was a long process. There was a lot of resistance, particularly from the automobile companies, where that was pinpointed as a major concern. But ultimately, it did lead to the passage of the Clean Air Act in 1970, and then since then, a number of other battles have taken place that have really pushed the government, particularly state and local governments, to move on this issue. And the air is better. It's still a long ways to go, but you've seen important improvements. I think in Hong Kong, you have a situation where there are some similarities. You've had the ability of research. My colleague Simon Ng at the Civic Exchange with others has pinpointed where those problems lie, and there is action. There's the groups like the Clean Air Network that have tried to make the problem visible, but there needs to be a lot more to be done.
Now, I'm sure that the situation may be very similar in Los Angeles and also Hong Kong. It's all very well for groups such as Civic Exchange and others to try to push for certain action. But, of course, there are very many vested interests, as you alluded to earlier, with the pollution in Los Angeles. How is it possible to overcome these barriers?
I think so, but it can only be overcome if there is this link between action from below and changes made at the top. That kind of interaction is really critical, and you can see it beginning to happen when, for example, the fight around ship emissions, both in Los Angeles and in Hong Kong, was a long and protracted battle. But that combination of research, the action from below, and then ultimately the government weighing in, and even the shipping interests and the port operators understood that greening the port is a win-win situation for everybody.
Now, of course, the United States and Hong Kong have different democratic traditions. In Los Angeles, of course, you can vote people in and out of power. The situation is different here in Hong Kong. To what extent does the difference in the democratic institutions going to help or hinder people, do you think?
That's a really important question. I think it's a complex question because although we have a strong democratic tradition in the United States, there have been efforts to really undercut that, increase the difficulties of voting, for example, gerrymandering, changing the nature of districts so that it reduces the power of the vote. Nevertheless, there is that understanding of this is a democratic country, and one of the more interesting things that happened after Donald Trump was elected was the massive turnout of people in cities across the country, including Los Angeles, where 750,000 people took to the streets. And one of the chants was, "This is what democracy looks like." It isn't just the voting, but it's the popular expression, the popular articulation, and the organizing and organizational work that goes into making change happen. I think you have that capacity in Hong Kong in the sense of people do mobilize, but there are, of course, other limits in terms of democratic participation, particularly in terms of voting directly. I think the problem is not so much whether you have the vote, although that's a really powerful and significant issue. It's the ability to mobilize from below and cause action to occur at the top. And in the environmental area, especially in questions of sustainability, that's really a critical question that needs to be looked at. Can those kinds of actions take place above and beyond whether the vote, as important as it is available or not?
So the key to success really is getting people from the grassroots and upwards to care about the issues strongly enough to do something about it, really.
Care about and find the ways in which they can act together.
You've also mentioned something about food policies councils, or rather food policy councils in the United States, looking at the issue of food justice. That's something which isn't really known to us here, I don't think, in Hong Kong. What's the experience in the United States about these movements and what they can do?
Well, I think the food justice movement and the focus on changing the way the food system operates, the way, how food is grown and produced and what we consume, is a very powerful environmental question. And in the particularly last 15, 20 years, you've seen the rise of a food movement in the United States that's changed both people's perceptions about how food should be accessed and what should be available, but it's also run into the barriers of making that change. Nevertheless, it's a vibrant movement, and you are seeing changes happen on the ground, even when you now have a president who believes that let them eat sugar and salt and processed foods when it comes to school lunch. It's a new change that the president has brought about. In Hong Kong, where you have a food system that's 95% imports, I think it's a even more complex challenge. Nevertheless, you see stirrings of people engaged around food, particularly around questions of health. But it raises a larger issue. A lot of the food comes from the Guangdong and the Pearl River Delta, from a situation where Hong Kong has had a long history of connections to the area, and similar to air issues where you share an air basin, and water issues where you're drawing on water from the Pearl River Delta, it becomes incumbent on movements that do develop around food to think regionally, to think cross borders, the ways in which there can be connections made about new opportunities to grow food in a more sustainable way, to address the air quality issues.
So clearly you've got to have an agreement on acceptable standards on both sides then.
That's right. And you see, particularly in a couple of areas where that's begun to happen, the issue around ship emissions from the fuel that's used, which had a high sulfur content. L.A. really led the way, along with some European ports. Hong Kong stepped up to the plate around 2013. A long process that took place in Hong Kong, and now that's extended to China, and with recognition that air pollution is a problem that can't be ignored, and this is one of the areas where improvements can be made. So it is possible. It doesn't happen across the board. There's resistance to it, but that kind of interregional cooperation is important, and when we think about the kinds of issues that we talked about in the Global Cities book.
Some very useful thoughts there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the programme this morning. That's Professor Robert Gottlieb.